For the past few weeks, I've been asking people about their paranormal encounters, trying to uncover the scary unknown. I spoke with a few people, and they all pointed out to old sailor Ed. Apparently, he has seen some things during his life as a sailor that scared even the bravest souls. I was told that old sailor Ed spends his time almost every day in the local pub, drinking his sorrows away. Apparently, Ed is a burdened man, not coping with the outside world anymore. They said I should go to the pub around noon, at a point where Ed is still sober enough to talk to me. So, I went the next day at noon, hoping to find the so-called old sailor Ed. The pub itself was very old. I walked by it a few times, but there was never much life in it. It always looked a bit darker and grim than a normal pub. Stepping inside the building, the first thing that came to me was the strong beer smell and the dark undertone of the room. I walked towards the bar and asked for a cola. The barman, an old and withered man, gave me a glass as he looked at me with a bitter look on his face. I asked the barman if old sailor Ed was here, and he pointed at the darkest part of the room. It was in a corner where a small table stood. Sitting at the table there was a small figure of a man with a big glass of beer. His posture seemed as if he had lost all hope in life, crooked, foul, and old. I walked towards him and asked if he was Sailor Ed. He got startled as I spoke to him, as if I ran towards him trying to do him harm. I told him that many people told me about him and his encounters with the paranormal. Then I told him about my own paranormal encounter, and why I would like to hear his story. He bluntly stated that I should pick up a chair and come sit at the table with him. He would tell me a story on one condition. I could only drink something with alcohol, and not some children's drink like I had right now. After I got a beer from the bar, I went back to the dark corner where old sailor Ed was waiting for me. I asked first who he was and what he did. Apparently old sailor Ed, when he was not old, had sailed literally the 7 seas. He delivered, under heavy fire, supplies to the Americans during the Vietnam War, where he was in his 20s. In 1970, he sailed in the Bohan cyclone, considered the worst cyclone of the century. He helped aiding many poor countries stricken by disaster, delivering goods to those nations who needed them. Most of this all in danger of his own life. Old sailor Ed still has his golden earring in his ear. It is a sailor tradition, so that if he died, they could use the money from the earring to buy him a coffin and grave. Ed, though his appearance as a withered old man, is one of the toughest men I have ever seen. When I asked him to tell me about the ghost ship, he turned into a small child who almost started crying. He asked me how I knew of that encounter with the ghost ship. I merely told him I did my research. He could tell me anything about all the other ghost stories on sea, but not that one. So I bargained and persuaded him, and finally, he agreed. After buying him 2 additional beers and a shot of rum, he started to tell the story of the ghost ship. It was an experience so scary and so devastating to his life that he still is being haunted by the thought of it. It was an autumn day when old sailor Ed sailed away. The cold breeze of winter could already be felt as his ship drifted on the sea. The shipment was just a regular delivery, just like any other, told Ed. This time their cargo consisted of many different types of herb and cheese. Ed's face turned sour as he spoke about the strong smell that came from the cargo deck. It was not fun to check the goods, though everything else was just the way he liked it on the sea. According to Sailor Ed, the journey was going great. There was not a spot of dark clouds on the horizon, and the waves were just as calm as an old dog sleeping on his bench. Then, in just a few hours, as they were only halfway through the journey, a storm came crashing down upon them. This storm was not informed by the weather agency they used. Apparently, those are the worst kinds of storms. For 4 days it rained and poured down from the heavens. The storm was so bad that all the equipment malfunctioned, and they sailed off course. When the storm finally calmed, they could see how far they were from their normal route. It would take another week or more before they would see land again. It was a bummer, but they had enough food, and luckily, there was not much damage to the ship. For 2 days straight, they sailed in unknown waters. As the wind became more silent, The waves barely moved. Eventually it all stopped. Silence filled the ocean as a thick fog appeared creeping around the ship. As the crew of the ship looked at the water, one of the sailors shouted that a ship was following them. The strange ship went straight towards them. If the captain did not maneuver quick enough, they would have been hit. All the crew looked on at the strange ship that almost had hit them, pass by slowly. The captain tried to contact them on the radio, but the only sound he heard was static. That was the first strange thing. To hear such static, one must turn on the radio. Then the captain heard a noise coming from the radio, but it sounded distorted and did not make any sense. He disregarded the strange noise as a broken radio, probably damaged during the storm. But that was not the only thing that damaged the strange ship during the storm. It was covered in rust and algae. A crane on the ship was split in two and hanged outside the boat on a thread. The lights in the wheelhouse were all dark, and it seemed no one was steering the ship. The whole crew of the ship, including Ed, was standing on the deck watching as the ship came close to their ship. They couldn't see anybody on board, as if the ship were unmanned. They tried to get the attention of someone by shouting or calling them, but there was no response. They warned the strange ship multiple times that if there was no answer, they would try to board it. No response came, so they stopped the strange ship and prepared to board it. 3/4 of the crew went on board of the strange ship, including Sailor Ed. Ed shook his head as he thought about his first step on the godforsaken ship. Something deep inside his bones and heart felt the dark and sinister undertone of that strange ship. He told me that when he felt that, he should go with his gut and go back down to his own ship. But he was younger and foolish. He thought he was brave and nothing could harm him. So he stayed on and looked at the desolated ship. A few members of the crew stayed on deck checking for any resemblance of life. Ed and 4 others went to the wheelhouse to see what kind of ship it was and to whom it belonged to. In the wheelhouse, they found old broken stuff. Many maps were damaged, and the steering wheel was almost perished. They looked through the items on a shelf to see if any name or place could be uncovered. Ed stated that he did find eventually a name of the captain, but he was brutally interrupted by a cold, ominous breeze of wind coming from a door leading further into the ship. In the entrance of the door, there stood a sailor of the strange ship. He was as pale as snow, his lips were blue, and his clothes were scratched and had many holes in them. The tone in the wheelhouse just changed in an instant. Everybody was quiet. Ed could hear his own heartbeat pouncing out of his chest. The strange sailor looked deceased and not real. Everything about him was horrifying. The strange sailor just stood in the doorway, not saying anything, only watching as the few men looked at him in horror. One of the oldest of the group asked him eventually who he was. The strange sailor looked at him with eyes as lifeless as can be. No soul was to see in the body of the sailor. The only thing the sailor said in a creaking and inhumanly way was, "Come," as he walked back through the door he just had opened. As mindless zombies, they walked after him. The strange sailor led them more and more into the ship. Because of some strange thing, they all followed. Even Ed went deeper and deeper into the ship without any hesitation. The deeper they got, the darker it became. The lights in the ship got more broken, and the sunlight was eventually nowhere to be seen. Ed looked into a few rooms as they walked. He recalled that all the stuff was broken. It seemed like a big fight had been taking place. In one room, with big letters on the wall stood, "Run," but all of them kept walking. Eventually, they were so deep in the ship, it would be hard to come out. The oldest man of the group became very much annoyed and snapped out of his mindless walking. He asked immediately for an explanation and who the strange sailor was. The strange sailor turned in the most frightful way possible around. He had a big grin on his face as he looked at the 5 men standing in front of him. "Go in there," he said in the scariest way possible while opening a door. The door led to the belly of the ship. It was pitch black and the air was foul. The strange sailor went in, and like good sheep, the 5 men followed him. At last, Ed went into the door. As all the lights of the world went away, and each step deeper inside, the more hope of loving the world went away. He knew something very awful would happen, but he just kept walking downwards. He then stopped for a second to think of what he was doing. He looked around him and saw nothing. The person in front of him, a young cook, was already not to be seen. He wanted to turn around and leave this place, but a voice right next to him said, "Go on," and he became the mindless sheep again. He almost took another step down, only to wake up out of his mindless state by a horrible scream. It was an agonizing scream of pain, fear, and horror. Ed immediately turned around and ran upstairs out of the horrible place. He stood by the door for a few seconds in the hope that one of the other sailors would come up the stairs just like him. As he looked down at the pitch blackness, he heard steps coming from the stairs, first slowly, then faster, and then straight up running tempo. He then saw the strange sailor coming from downstairs towards him, with a big grin on his face and foam coming out of his mouth. Ed immediately turned around and ran towards the exit. He ran as fast as he could, hearing the strange sailor running after him in a very fast tempo. At one point, he could feel the rumpled fingers of the strange sailor for a second touch his neck. "Come with me. Your friends are waiting for you," screamed the strange sailor in a horrible way. It was a miracle Ed knew the way out of this big ship, and after what seemed like an eternity, he came out of the wheelhouse onto the deck. There he screamed for everyone to get off the strange ship and leave it immediately. He looked around to see if the strange sailor followed him on deck. In the wheelhouse, he could clearly see the figure of the man standing there, watching him in cold blood. Ed carefully went towards the ship, knowing that he would leave behind those innocent men to their doom. It was in just seconds that everyone left the strange ship. The captain asked Ed where the other 4 men were who were with him. Ed only shook his head, and by the expression of his face, the captain knew something horrible happened. As they had almost disembarked from the ship, the young man who was with Ed in the strange ship ran on deck screaming to be saved. The captain personally got him off the strange ship and gave him something to drink. He looked horrible. Though he was young, his hair had turned gray and his eyes were almost white in color. He was covered in blood, hair, and things still unknown to this day. The captain quickly ordered to leave and head straight to the nearest port. As they sailed away, the crew looked at the strange ship, now dubbed the Ghost Ship. Standing in daylight with a big grin on his face looked the strange sailor. Waving as they went away, another sailor stood close next to him screaming for help, but the captain ignored it, leaving the poor sailor behind. The screams that echoed on the sea gave everyone a sinister feeling of horror and fright. The young sailor never said what happened down there, deep in the belly of the ship. After 10 days, he had hung himself. Written in his note, he stated that the grin of the man haunts him all the time, and this is the only way to get rid of it. Sadly, on the face of the young man, the same grin was to be seen. They tried to make it go away, but it would always return until he got cremated. For Ed, his sailing days were over. He stopped sailing and he became a carpenter. After 10 years, he became a sailor again. His desire of the sea was greater than the fear of that ship. He told me that sometimes, out in the distance, he could see the appearance of that strange ship coming closer and closer, as if it was still haunting him. 20 years after encountering the strange ship, when he was alone on deck, he saw it again appearing on the horizon. On deck, the strange sailor stood grinning and smiling at him. Next to the strange sailor was the sailor they left. He looked so bad and so awful, Sailor Ed couldn't describe it. That was the last time he ever went on a ship again and went into retirement. Now old Sailor Ed lives in Rotterdam, living the last days of his life almost always in a pub. He told me that the grin of the strange sailor still haunts him during the night, but drinking helps him forget. I thanked him for his story and bought him another beer. Right before I went home, he stopped me, saying, "Whatever you're looking for, watch out. It might come looking for you."